Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Here we have a really cool opening, the Grob Gambit. If you're looking for an opening to throw your opponent off, this might just be it. This is a really classic gambit. You just start with pawn g4, and we have a lot of tricks here. Objectively, it is not the best opening by any means, but it does have so many tricks that your opponent really has to be careful for. And so the most popular move here for black is to play pawn d5. Now, e5 is also good opening principles. That is perfectly playable as well, but most people will develop the d-pawn because they want to try and threaten taking this g4 pawn right away. And so I just want to show if they don't do that, say they continue opening principles a different way, then we just continue normally with our fianchetto, and we have a ton of pressure on the long diagonal. Now, let's say, for example, they don't do that, and they play a different developing move, say like knight f6, common for King's Indian structures, and very similar things. Now we can actually threaten to just play g5, and this is actually really annoying for their knight. Like, do they really want to come back? And if they go here, you can possibly fianchetto, or you can kind of switch plan and just grab the center yourself, either e4 or knight c3, and white's actually doing really well here. Now let's go back to d5 because this is the most popular move, and so we will continue with our fianchetto. And we just have so many ideas, mostly on this long diagonal, or if their knight ever comes here, we kick the knight. Now, of course, they are threatening our pawn here, so let's give them the pawn. If they have the option taken, they'll most likely take. And now we play this pawn to c4, and we're going to see very soon this queen b3 idea. But first, we need to show what happens if they take the pawn, because, of course, if we offer a pawn on c4, we have to ask ourselves what happens if they take. And if they take, well, here we just play bishop captures b7, and most players playing black, they just didn't see this tactic, and then they feel like they're losing. Now, interestingly enough, even in this position, black is actually okay, despite losing the rook. Now, actually, what they should be doing here is not choosing to save the rook. And the reason for that is, let's say they allow this, knight d7, you allow them to take the rook, queen to a8, and now black actually has a ton of pressure on the long diagonal themselves, all the way down here. And so how did this white actually prevent any of that? Well, they probably want to play pawn to f3. That's really the only reasonable idea here, and just kick the bishop and cut down on the queen's scope. Now, I will note that if instead we tried knight to f3, then knight e5 is actually winning for black. There's just too many ideas here, and there's a lot of pressure on this knight, and white is actually already losing the game. But let's say that, you've watched this video, you do know to play pawn to f3, and so now, if they're really studied, they'll play pawn to e5. And this is actually a really cool position, where it's roughly equal. Black is an ever so slight smidge better, but certainly not as much as you would expect for being up one pawn of material. Like, we do have compensation for this. The engine only sees black about half a pawn up, and it's a playable position. So if you study this and you get into this position, you're probably in pretty good shape here. Instead of capturing, what white should actually do is ignore the rook. As crazy as that sounds, material is not that important here. And so you actually play this really funny move again, knight to a3. And knight to a3, of course, you're just attacking this pawn, and it's very difficult to defend. Like, black is probably best off to play e5, and you recapture, and this is about equal, which again, for an opening that you've thrown your opponent out of opening theory, this gives you a big advantage, even if it's actually about the same, objectively speaking. But now, of course, we're going to answer what happens if they just go here. Instead of e5, they go here, attacking your bishop. No problem, you'll just bring the bishop back to c6, and now, again, you're threatening recapture. You'll have your material, and everything is fine, and you have a really cool position. Now, let's return here, because most players are not going to just fall for this right off the bat. And so there's many other things that can go wrong. It's not only the taking on b7. So let's go to the queen move that we were mentioning. So one very common way that black can try and play is realize that threat and just defend the center with c6. But if they defend the center with c6, I really like just trading pawns and then playing queen b3. Really strong, but we're also attacking b7. And this is actually really difficult because our queen attacking that square, they're probably best to just develop the center and maybe even bring the bishop back at some point. Or find some other way of giving up a pawn, even if it means giving up this b7 pawn. And most players do not want to do that. They want to keep the extra material and try and prove that they can beat this opening, which is a little easier said than done. Now let's look at one other common way that they could go wrong. In this position here, following from this, they could play e6. Very common move to hold the center, trying to address that triangle idea, d5. But now they fall for a very common trap. You play queen to a4 check, and then they have to block the check. You pick up the bishop. And so knowing that their bishop is a little vulnerable here, if we go back, some players might realize this and get a little trickier and go, oh, okay, I see their plan. I see what they're threatening. What if we actually try something else? Say knight to f6, because it develops and it defends the bishop. Well, in that case, you can actually just capture on b7, which I kind of like, and then black will play here, and it's roughly equal. Black is a smidge better in this, but considering that they're out of opening theory, we might have an advantage here as well, and we have the easier play. Now, what you could also do if you don't like being down a little bit with black having the advantage here, instead of taking on b7, you can also just play knight c3, a really interesting move, attack the center again, and maintain the tension, and kind of surprise your opponent, like, why haven't you taken this pawn already? But now, once again, we'll return back to this c4 move, kind of our thematic main line that we have here. And so what else can they try, right? Because obviously c6 doesn't work, and e6 just blunders the bishop, as we looked at. In this case, it's slightly different because the move order, we're playing a little earlier here, but again, they do have to be very careful. Something like this is very common to try and hold this pawn, and almost always it's wrong because of all the weaknesses they have on this long diagonal. So what they probably should be doing, not so intuitive, the computer actually recommends just reinforcing your center and allowing to give back the pawn. But if they play this, then we can just trade here. We have a really cool triangle, and now we have this double attack here, a really nice fork of the rook and this pawn, and so most players are going to see that and they'll want to defend the rook, but then you'll take the pawn. And not only have they lost castling rights, but white is actually winning because now we can actually grab the knight. So many traps that you definitely have to avoid here if you're playing black, makes this a really powerful opening for white to surprise your opponent. And once again, returning back to the c4 move, what if they understand that their bishop is a bit vulnerable, they don't play the knight f6 we looked at? Another really creative try that you'll see is bishop to e6. And this one is a lot less common, but it shows that they have a little understanding, or at least tactical insight of maybe what pieces are going to be weak or not. Now, what they're hoping for is that you'll trade pawns, they'll take back, and this is completely fine. Like, I'll even put it on the board just to illustrate the point that, like, in this position, really, what they're hoping for, really, we have nothing and black is better. Now, what they're not calculating correctly is we do not have to trade all of this way and get rid of our really great bishop that was fianchettoed on g2. So instead of this, we do not trade pawns on d5, and we can just maintain the tension. We can just play queen b3. And now their bishop is actually a bit silly, kind of blocking in this pawn from advancing, and how's this bishop going to develop? It's really difficult. Maybe they can try and fianchetto, but again, this takes extra time. And that is time that black does not have because we'll keep attacking them. If they try and defend their b7 pawn like this, things can go wrong really quickly. You can just take here in the center, and now your bishop is attacked. If you take here, you walk into the same problem we looked at, and now it's even worse because you're threatening the rook and this here, very deadly. Just to illustrate the point, say they block for the rook, you go here, this, and again, we can pick up the knight, so they don't want to fall for that. So here, instead of taking, they will probably drop back their bishop, but even in this case, white is still better because we will play knight to f3, continuing to develop. They will probably do the same with their knight, hopefully try and get their bishop out of here, probably fianchetto in most lines, and then try and get castled. But even still, we will have the advantage. We will play knight to e5, almost forcing a fianchetto. It's very difficult for them to try and get castled. And so if they do this, now we have a really cool idea. We play pawn to d6. It looks like it can be taken two different ways, but both of those are actually losing right on the spot. And so the reason is we're threatening this discovered attack, which is going to be checkmate in one move, so they definitely have to block that. But if they address the checkmate threat, now we've also unleashed this other discovered attack, and we've just won the rook. So once again, this g4 move is really interesting. Such a rare opening to face, but it's a real classic. And so if you really want to try opening attacks, try gambits, and just experiment a bit, or if you want to practice your attacking ability, I think this is a really great opening to do so, just to give you some of that practical experience. Statistically speaking, out of the 20 opening moves white could choose, g4 objectively is the worst one according to the computer. But what I love about it is that it's got so many tricks that some of the other bad moves don't necessarily offer. And so even if it's objectively worse, we're not actually that horrible. And we've seen a lot of these lines, we're only down half a pawn to a pawn in the evaluation. And if we know these lines much better than the opponent, the practicality might justify doing that. And especially if you're doing it for cool games or for experience in attacking, it could be a really good opening to try. So I hope this short video helped explain the Grob opening to everyone. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.